Working here on our 2001 Audi A4 Avant 1.8T Quattro. The car has been making some uh, scraping noises and braking, particularly on the back right passenger side. So we pulled the wheel. Wheel has lug bolts rather than studs and nuts like most American cars. This is pretty typical for German cars. So we pulled it off. A lot of rust. You can see the surface is pretty crappy, accounting for a lot of the sound. But we had to check to see if the rotor can be turned. That is, that they machine it down so that this nice, solid surface, it would delete the rust. But in order to determine whether the rotor can be turned or not, you have to check the thickness. So we used one of these, this caliper or micrometer, and we determined that it was at about 9 millimeters. The specs for this car, for this rotor, minimum of 8.5. So we're right at the edge. Really is not advisable. You don't want your rotors getting too thin. And you can see here the pads are also pretty rusted and thin. So we have got a set of rotors and pads on order from O'Reilly's. Getting the lifetime warranty pads, the better power pads. The cheap ones are about 12 bucks for a rear set. Good ones about 32, 33, and the rotors 25, 26 bucks a piece. So not a terribly expensive job. It's going to be under $100 to do both sides. So what we're going to have to do here is detach the caliper. Right, that's this part here. We've got to detach it, swing it off, and then we're going to use a separator tool to pry it open to get the pads off and then knock the rotor out of there. So that is our operation here, and should be pretty simple. You have two bolts here, right? You got this rubber boot right there. So it's compressed on there, these two bolts, and should take those off, and then caliper will swing out. I'm going to clean it up, work on resting all this rust. I'm using some silicone spray and wheel bearing grease in order to get the rust situation under control here. Calipers are good, they're not leaking or anything. You can also see the bleed valve right here. So if you've got squishy brakes and you need to bleed them, there's your bleed valve. In order to bleed, you have somebody sit in the car and you open this valve, you press the brakes down to the floor, close the valve, let the brakes come up. You do that same basic process as bleeding a clutch, same kind of system. So should be relatively straightforward job, not a terribly difficult job, and it should give us much better braking power and no more vibrating, crunching sound at stop. Okay, for removal of the rotor itself, the rotor is basically just kind of held in there by pressure, so a good whack with a rubber mallet will dislodge it. You can see, just right, it's just kind of hanging in there. The caliper's still on. I'm about to knock the caliper off. But yeah, it's already ready to come off. Yep. So pretty simple. I mean, once you've dislodged it, then we're going to remove caliper again. I've got PB Blaster soaking on the bolts there, and then that's going to be, this tool here is for compressing the piston.
Yep, this will, in place of the outer shoe, will press in either with the pad in place, or we'll just press against the piston directly, either way. Yeah, so that was nice it came loose real easy.
Yeah, even though it was super rusted and everything, but rubber mallet's really the way to go. I mean, it's
optimal. I was going to use hammer and wood because it'll severely put vibration to it, but it didn't need that much.
Right, so. And the mallet is a good way, it'll ensure.
It's very gentle.
Yeah, it's not going to.
In case you can turn your rotor, you won't be ruining it.
Right, we are going to be chucking this and getting another one, so it really didn't matter, but still just best practice to use a rubber mallet.
Yep. I'm just applying a little gentle pressure.
Yep.
And the thing is,
so we've got the two bolts. They were both 13 millimeter, pretty easy. Just use the crescent wrench and knock those out. That loosened this, so you could see it wiggling here, but the brake pad itself was still compressed, so we're just trying to.
The calipers for disc brakes have to keep constant slight pressure on the rotor, just a little bit. and it's holding enough that the rotor doesn't want to, the caliper
Doesn't
won't
wobble.
slide off.
Right, right.
So what I'm doing is I'm putting this in and twisting it this way.
Mm-hmm.
Because in here, even if this was a good rotor, it's still pressing in here, which is not a reusable brake surface.
Mm-hmm.
I'm prying against the outer pad.
And you can see the whole caliper starting to move here.
And I'm just wiggling it because
Yep.
it varies the pressure against the piston. Is it the correct way to do it? No. But if it's done gently, it's not going to hurt anything. Here I'm going to twist the opposite way. I'm going to twist this way,
right.
because I'm trying to put the pressure in by the hub.
Yep, there you go.
And see, when we get this to go a little bit, it will get the pressure off.
Yep.
This is what I'm trying to do. Just a little bit here and there. You can't force it fast. You can't press the easy button. You just got to piddly widdly. Just take your time with it. As you see, the screwdriver is going in farther
Yep,
and farther.
deeper and deeper, wedging it in.
Which means it's retracting the piston.
Right.
And that's what we want, so that we'll let go of the rotor. Now it should be enough where this should just slide up like
Yep.
that.
And now the whole caliper.
It's still dragging because there's a lot of
Right,
rust on
well,
it.
right, it's real rusty. Yep, there you go. And there's the brake pads.
Yeah, and there is nothing left of those. Look at
Yeah,
them.
those are toasty.
There's only a trace of material on the outer one, and
Right.
there's nothing on the inner one.
It's-
See if you can get them off and look at them. There's nothing to those. You wonder why you had a
Yeah.
little brake noise. There's nothing.
Yeah, there's
to
your
that.
brake noise. That's why it sounded like it was going.
Now here's the piston, and this piston's going to go from here
Yep.
all the way into about to there. It's going to go that far. These pads.
And so that's what this is for, right?
Yeah, they're almost as thick as that, and that's how much is missing. That's how far
Right.
out that piston is. It's almost ready to pop the seal.
Sometimes when you're working on cars, even if you have the right tool for the job, sometimes it can still just not want to go. In this case, trying to remove the caliper supports here, the caliper frame, and I am not a fan of Allen head, hex head bolts, but there are two of them. One and where's the other guy? Two. It's on the. See these guys. You know, this is where the 13 bolts were, and so there's one there. There's one there on the back side. Well, being on the back side, these have gotten a lot of corrosion on them over the years, and they are just about as rust welded as I've ever seen a bolt. So in this case, even though I've got the right tool, which is an 8mm. Now I started out trying to use just a regular Allen wrench, like this guy here. Couldn't get nearly enough torque on it. So I dug out my Allen wrench sockets, thinking, you know, I'll get my wrench on it and no problem. Well, still problem. So I've been blasting it with PB Blaster, and I'm going to wait and see if that helps loosen it up. You can also see here the new pads, which are considerably thicker. The old pads were pretty well completely gone. I mean, they were down to just about nothing. So here's the new pads, and the new pads, they scissor in there into this groove right here. So you got to pop that into the groove. That's what holds them in place, and then the piston compresses them. In order to get them on there, you have to compress the piston. Now again, I'm still trying to get the rotor off, and in order to get the rotor off, I've got to get this support bracket off. That's what's being the problem. If I could just go ahead and get that off, I could pop my rotor off and go ahead and pop my new rotors on. So in the meantime, while I'm waiting for the PB Blaster to do its job, I've been moving my attention to the piston. Now the piston just has this free-floating rubber boot to keep it protected. Now in this case, it had a lot of crud built up in there, so I've been digging out all the crud with my little pick there so that that will rotate freely, because you don't want it to bind and then twist as you're compressing piston. Now here's our piston compression tool. Just a few bucks at O'Reilly's. They had one on the shelf. You can see it's a universal design, so it's got a lot of different configurations. The one for the Audi is the really wide. It's just got two prongs there, and it's on there fine. And all you're going to be doing, you got to hold it, you know, you got to hold on to the caliper while you do this, but turning that will rotate the piston and compress it, thereby allowing you to get your brake pads on there. Now, again, we're close to being done, if only this daggum thing, if the bracket would come off so I could get my dang rotor off. I got the rotors, I'm so ready to put them on, I just gotta get this darn thing off. So I'm gonna keep fiddling with it. You know, one thing with breaking loose rusted bolts is you can whack at them a little bit from the back side with a hammer. I've been doing that to try to just dislodge the rust welding. I've also been taking my pick tool and digging in the crevice, trying to dig a path around the bolt so that the PB Blaster will soak in around the threads. So far, haven't had any luck, so it's going to take some finagling. Key in this sort of situation, you know, it's easy to start getting upset and frustrated, and that's when you start really making mistakes and can do some damage. So, you know, like what I'm doing here, I'm turning my attention to the piston. I'm going to go ahead and try to get the piston compressed and just let those bolts soak for a while and come back to them periodically, see if I can break them loose. So it took a little bit of doing and a lot of turning to compress this piston. It was really far out. It was basically all the way out, and it took a lot of turns for it to compress, but you see now what it's supposed to look like when it's in its compressed. This rubber boot contracts just about completely till it's flattened. I would recommend, I mean, you got a couple options here. If you want to leave the caliper on the car, you can always take it off, hook it up to a bench vise. Then of course you're draining your fluid. I wanted to just keep it on the car if possible, so I used my quick grip here and grabbed it, because for a while there I fought with it, just trying to hold it with one hand and turn it with the other, and that was not happening. It was very slow and very frustrating. So I went and grabbed my quick grip, and this is a good place to grab it there. Of course, that's assuming you still have these on there, which I do. So I would recommend compressing the piston before removing these. Of course, you could always take the rotor off, replace it, put those back on, but you will want these on there if you want to grip it on. You know, you could also have a second person holding it, but the stability of having it gripped on really is to be preferred, because it's a rather odd configuration, and you really have to, when you're winding it on there, you've really got to push it with one hand here, you know, and I was grabbing it like this so that it would seat really proper, and then you can push it with, you can actually turn it with the other hand. At first, when I was holding it with two hands, I was trying to wind it with just my hand, and it was working, but very slowly, and I would have been out here for hours, and it would have been a lot more difficult. This made it much more expedient. Still not an easy thing to do, so it will take you some time, so be prepared for that when doing a brake job. But the key is that you've got to get it wound back far enough that it will have both of your brake pads plus the rotor. Now, I might have to, depending on if I can get this daggum the support piece here, if I cannot get it off, then I'm probably going to have to take it into the tire shop, and in that case I would just put the new pads on and let them do the rotor. I'm really hoping, because it's really just, it's frustrating because it's just those two daggum bolts. So I'm going to hit it with some more PB Blaster and take a break now that my caliper's down and wound back. I also would recommend, here's your bleed valve right here. A couple times during the operation I just opened it and let it drip for a second, just to kind of relieve the pressure on the piston, and then tighten it back up. You obviously don't want to leave it open, or you be sucking some air. And of course, when you do a brake job, at the end of it you're going to want to bleed the brakes anyway, but still, I just let that, you know, get the pressure off. It was definitely not easy, but there it is. That's what it looks like when it is retracted. So I'm done messing with this for the day. I'm going to hit it with a little more PB Blaster on those two bolts, but I went ahead and reassembled the caliper. I haven't put any pressure on it, so it'll be super simple to get it back off so I can mess with it again. But this is what it should look like with the brakes, the brake pads in there. You can see we got this V, okay, see, like this, and there's these two little grooves that run along just on the outside of the big open empty groove. And this, the idea is that this just provides pressure. It pushes against the caliper here, and so you can see what it looks like with it reassembled there. I went ahead and greased the caliper surface. You don't want to get any of it on the brake pads or anything like that, but surface itself, the boots, that sort of thing. So that's all I'm going to do for the moment. I'm going to see about, if there's something I'm missing with how you're supposed to get those back brackets off. But if all else fails, I will reassemble this in this condition, even though the rotor is not good. It's not to the point where it's going to fall apart, and it's got new pads so they won't be grinding into it like it was before. So all that's good. If I have to, I will take it over to the tire shop and have them actually put the rotor on, which I'm trying to avoid, but those two bolts just are super bad rust welded on there, and I just cannot seem to get enough tension, enough force onto them to break them loose. So again, I'm gonna hit it with some more PB and let it soak overnight, and give it another whack tomorrow. If I can't get them off, I'll have to take it in to get the rotors, which is so obnoxious because they're just so close. It's just got to get this bracket piece here off in order to get those rotor out of there. So we're here on the driver's side of the car, and you can see now what it looks like with the rotor removed. There's our old rusty rotor that we pulled off of there. Very rusty. And you can see the bracket here has been pulled off. It took a lot of fighting to get that guy off of there. Here are the bolts that were retaining the rotor bracket, and they're staggered length. You can see they had factory Loctite on them, although I assume that they had been pulled off. They had to have been pulled off at some point. This car has almost 190,000 on it, and seems pretty impossible that the rotors had never been removed or turned in all that time and mileage. But it was a real battle to get these guys off of there. As you can see, I've got the sway bar that connects there in the top. I pulled that so that I could get more room here to work on the top bolt, the longer of the two bolts. A lot of PB blasting, a lot of fighting with it, tried all sorts of different stuff. You can see that they're starting to strip. I was really worried that they had completely stripped, which would have been a very bad day. I still haven't gotten the other side off. I'm going to do that once I complete the reassembly of this side. But I really hate these Allen head bolts. They are just begging to be stripped the way that they're designed, and there's nothing you can really grab on. You can see where I was trying to double torque it by having a vice grip on there in addition to my my ratchet, and took a lot of fighting, a lot of, the rest of the disassembly took almost no time. I mean, I could probably had it off and back together in about an hour's time. It took at least an hour just to get these bolts off. A lot of fighting with them. Oddly enough, this side wasn't as bad as the other side. Here are the pads that I pulled off, and they're worn down some, but they're not completely dissolved like the other side had been. And they look like they're about the same shape in terms of about the same amount of rust. So peculiar. I don't know if that has something to do with maybe the e-brake. I don't know. But for whatever reason, the caliper on the other side was riding them harder. Like this one is still actually pretty good, other than it's just rusted pretty bad. I'm still going to go ahead and replace them, clearly, since I got them off. And the ones I'm putting on there are lifetime warranty from O'Reilly's, and I think it was about $35 for the pair. So really not a bad deal on that. But to ensure that if I ever need to get that rotor bracket back off, I am deleting these bolts and replacing them. And so I went to my local hardware store, which I really like, particularly for bolt buying, a heck of a lot better than going to a big box store, because they have everything out. where you can grab at it. So I have all my pieces here in the bag. So I'm going to put regular old bolts on there. And I did get some blue Loctite, Permatex brand, but the thread compound, because you do want these, you know, good and secure on there. But I want to be able to get the daggum things back off. So these were both 10 millimeter. Now by 10 millimeter I mean the width of the bolt itself, not the head, but the width of the bolt. These are 10 millimeter by 1.25, or fine thread. Extra fine is, I believe, 1, and coarse is 1.5 for this size. But these are 1.25, so they were 10 millimeter bolts by 1.25, so I matched them for length. The slightly larger ones, I'm going to have to put washer on to space it, and I'm also going to put, I've got this washer plus a lock washer to keep it good and taut on there. Just because it couldn't get exactly the right length of bolt, and so it's, you know, it won't be any problem. There's plenty of room back there, so it's not going to have an issue with adding about, you know, maybe 1/8 of an inch to the bolt itself in order to get it matched up perfectly lengthwise. So I'm going to put these guys back on there. These will be much easier to get off. I've got 2 sets of them, so for both sides. And again, I am going to hit them with that blue Loctite just to make sure everything's good and snug. At this point, I'm going to go through the system here with, now that everything is off, I'm going to hit the hub here with my wire brush all this back, rest all that rust, hit everything with some grease. Obviously, you don't want the grease anywhere near your actual rotors and pads, but while you've got it all disassembled, you can freshen everything up with some grease, some lubricant. The other thing I'm going to do in order to wind this back, the best way is just to go ahead and put the retaining bolt bracket, right? Get this guy back on there, and that way you can go ahead and reattach the caliper with the rotor off. That way, much easier to wind. Obviously, you can't wind the piston with the caliper on, or with the rotor on there. That'll obviate the need for what I did with the other side, where I used that big vice grip or that big Irwin quick grip to hold on to it. So that's the process. Of course, I need to put that bolt back on there and get that reattached. Just wanted to have the extra room back there. It took a lot of fighting, but we did finally get it off. One other tool tip that I don't want to overlook in how I was able to get these horrible bolts off was by extending my socket. So the issue is I can't get in this amount of space. If I had a lift and was up on a lift, I could easily get from underneath and get a breaker bar in there, but with working on it just lifted like this, jacked up, not enough room to get a full-size breaker bar in there. So all you're working with is a little socket. So one of the things you can do, my uncle told me about this, and it was a great idea. You get a deep set socket that fits over the tip of your wrench, and then you can add extensions, because every inch that you can get further out, you're applying progressively more and more force to it. And so that was really helpful in the fight against this seized up bolt. So if you're fighting with a seized bolt, this is a great way to get some more torque on there without having to actually apply, you know, get a breaker bar in there, or, you know, use a air gun. So very helpful little handy tip. Working now on retracting the piston so that I can reassemble the system. I put the bracket, the rotor bracket, back on there so that I could reattach the piston to it. One thing you will want to note is even after you reattach the piston, it does have this this boot right here where there is a compression piston on the top and bottom where it attaches. So if you are pushing on it, it'll actually extend that out. And so you will need one of these. You will need a quick grip in order to keep that compressed so that you're pushing against it. You can see the new nice and shiny bolts in there. Both of them are spaced just perfectly. Something that I note now is that and I'm going to particularly do this when I get to the other side, if you're having a frozen bolt situation, don't try spraying on the head. I mean, you can, because there might be a little bit of rust welding there, but the threads only come in this last 3/4 of an inch or so into the bracket itself. Otherwise it's just drilled through on the retaining bracket on the back. So if you're trying to blast it with some penetrating oil, you should blast it from this side where the threads are. I think that's what actually made the difference in why I couldn't get the other one off, but I did get this one off because I had started doing that as I was working on it. So as I move to the other side, I am going to take that into account. But this is what it should look like as you are compressing the piston down. Just about done compressing it there. Should be about all the way down. Much easier to do, and again, you will need some sort of a grip device in order to compress that top part, the bracket piston. Otherwise, you will just extend it way out and overextend it and not get enough pressure pushing back against you. So here's the new rotor. Nice, shiny looking, very nice looking rotor. Considerable improvement over the crusty, rusty old thing I pulled off it. When you're hanging the rotor to put the new bracket, or put the brackets back on, I recommend just putting a couple of lugs just finger tight in there. That way it'll hold it up. It won't try to fall off on you while you're trying to get this situated. And of course I've got the new shiny new bolts on there. If you do replace the bolts with a new bolt, do make sure that you get it precisely the right length. You want it good and flush on the back side there, because as you can see, if it's too long, it'll actually run into and gouge the rotor, which you do not want. Also make sure when reassembling that these boots are good and secure here. You should have pressure there. So make sure that those are secured on there as well. It's very important. And then it's a matter of just putting the caliper back on and replacing the pads with the new pads. And here we have our nicely reassembled brake caliper, rotor, new pads. The pads are real easy to get in there. Once you got the rotor in, they just drop into the bracket, and you just attach the caliper back on. You do need to make sure that you compress those and get it straight on so that the retaining brackets follow into those grooves. But so far so good. This side is done. Just a matter of popping the wheel back on, and then I'm going to get back to the other side and see if I can get that those back bolts off and replace them with my new bolts. So sometimes when you're working on cars, even if you have the right tools, even if you have the right knowledge, it just does not want to work. This is a great example of that. I encountered what I'm officially calling the bolt from hell. This frigging thing, and I'm using polite language as best I can because I've poured obscenities into it. I have probably put over 8 hours just into extracting this one bolt. This is the top bolt that goes right here. You can see, stupid thing stripped out completely. I was able to crack it about a quarter turn by, you can see I drilled slots on the side of it so that my universal socket tool could at least grab it, and I got it to crack about a quarter turn, but it was still just not coming out at all. So I tried drilling it from the back. As you can see, there's no way, one thing, I smacked it with hammers, I did all the typical stuff. I sprayed probably a half a can of PB Blaster on it to no avail. You cannot heat it because it is literally an inch away from the CV joint here, which is rubber. And, that rubber would melt immediately upon heat, and I don't want to have to replace the CV joint. So I tried drilling it out from the back and using an extractor tool. I could just barely get my electric screwdriver in there. Good idea, but it did not have the torque. And not only that, let's see, what are the injuries that I've accrued here? Well, while hauling on it, I knocked my head extremely hard against the suspension piece here. So I got a big old welt in the side of my head. The worst one just happened a few minutes ago. So I had the extractor tool in there and hit it the first time I hit the power on the thing, and I didn't realize that I hadn't put the other bolt in. So the thing just went, oh my gosh, it smacked me right in the friggin' face. It went bam! And that piece right there smacked me right in the mouth and, in fact, chipped the heck out of my tooth. So now I've got a chipped ass tooth and my mouth is still bleeding. And finally, I just had to go nuclear option, and I drilled it out from this side. The way I was able to get to it is I pulled the shield off here, which has got 3 10mm bolts. In fact, one of them I need to drill out right there because it was broken. So I got the 10mm bolts out. I was able to, by kind of pulling on the rotor, I was able to get that out so that I could drill it. And finally drilled the damn thing. You can see I had to drill it basically down to the threads and then repeatedly smack it with a hammer until it finally broke loose. Now, of course, the problem is that the remainder is still frozen in there. So I'm going to see if maybe we can get that extracted. If not, I'm going to replace this piece. But gosh, what a absolute POS. Really, really pissed me off. I can't believe, in all my years of car repairs and all the jobs I've ever done, I've never had a bolt this persistent and impossible to get out. And if there's any Audi engineers out there, stop putting these damn bolts on your cars. These are awful, 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 awful. You cannot get enough torque on them. You put a little bit of rust in there, which of course they collect water because they got a big hole, and the inside just stripped, and then just absolutely could not get a hold of it. So hours and hours and hours later, injuries later, broke both of my universal, I broke one socket wrench trying to wrench it off. Both of my universal sockets, see these guys, which are awesome, are now all chewed up and not, they're slightly functional now, but not like they were because all the teeth in there got bent because the thing was just so rust welded in there. Just ridiculous. Stop putting these stupid bolts on your cars. Use regular daggum bolts. Oh my gosh. So I'm going to put these back in when I get the situation figured out and get the last little bit of it extracted from the brace piece. And of course, here's the one that's going to go in the long side. This you can get out. You can't get those dang things out. So I don't know. I feel like dousing this in gasoline and throwing it in a volcano. My uncle said that's too good for it. You ought to throw it in the fires of Mordor. I'm thinking maybe that I might actually frame this sucker on the wall because this is just horrid. I'm officially calling this the bolt from hell. So a 1-hour job turned into about a 10-hour job, but finally got this stupid thing back together. I had to extract this from the threads there, which I just kept drilling it until it got very, very thin and brittle, and then I was finally able to get a little lip of it and grab onto it with my vice grips and extract it. But this was a serious battle. This was the worst bolt I have ever encountered, and look at what that damn thing did to my face. Broke my tooth, got me right in the mouth. Awful, awful, awful. You can see all the shavings from drilling it out, but everything is back together now at last. So all I got to do is throw the wheel back on, tighten it down. Now once you're done with your brake job, it's always a good idea to bleed. Bleeding is real simple. You got your bleed valve right here. You have to have somebody in the car, somebody here, and you open the bleed valve, press the pedal down so it'll squirt out. Keep with the pedal down, you close it, and then you let it ride back up. That's all you have to do to cycle the fluid through and bleed it out. Pretty easy. When you're done with your brake job, make sure that you get in the car and with the key on, preferably with the engine on, just kind of tap the brake pedal. It's best not to immediately push it all the way down to the floor, but about half to 2/3 down, just keep pressing it till you get good solid connection, and then you're good to go. So hopefully if you're doing this job, you will not run into the same difficulty as I did, but I highly, highly recommend replacing these horrible, horrible bolts. Another shot of the bolt from hell here. Golly, that thing's awful. Why did they do it? Oh, it's just so awful. Horrible, horrible thing. Highly recommend replacing these with actual regular bolts. The bolts I put on there fit perfect. There's no issue of room. So the only reason that I can imagine is they put this on here to try to keep you out of the system, so that you have to take it in, presumably to the dealer. Oh, horrible, 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 horrible. So got those replaced, and should be back on the road now.